The horrible effects of space radiation on astronauts Valery Polyakov spent 437 days in space. He landed in 1995, stood up from his capsule, and smiled for the cameras. He looked fine. He walked unaided. He told reporters he felt good. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say yet, was that something had already begun inside his body that would never stop. His DNA had been hit thousands of times by particles traveling at nearly the speed of light. His brain structure had physically changed. And the damage wasn't finished. It was just getting started. Polyakov died in 2022. He was 80 years old. And the full catalog of what space did to his body is still not entirely public. That story, the one where the smiling astronaut lands safely and everyone applauds, that's the story space agencies want you to see. This is the other story. The one about what radiation actually does to a human body in space. Not the theoretical risk. Not the general concern. The specific, documented, devastating biological reality that astronauts face every single time they leave Earth's atmosphere. And here is the first thing you need to know, right now, before anything else. NASA has understood the severity of this problem since the 1970s. They've known about brain damage, cardiac death, permanent vision loss, and heritable DNA mutations for decades. They kept sending people anyway. Because the mission always came first. If you want to understand the real cost of space exploration, not the triumphs, not the flags, not the inspiration, subscribe to this channel right now. Because we don't do the press release version. We do the truth. 3 astronauts changed everything we know about space radiation and the human brain. Scott Kelly spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station. His identical twin brother Mark stayed on Earth. NASA studied them both for years. The results were alarming in ways that surprised even the scientists running the study. Scott's telomeres, the protective caps on his chromosomes, lengthened in space, then shortened dramatically when he returned. His gut microbiome shifted. His gene expression changed in over 1,000 genes. Some of those changes reversed after landing. Many did not. 5 years later, Scott still reported cognitive changes. Fatigue. Memory inconsistencies. He's written about it publicly. NASA published the twin study in 2019. It confirmed that space fundamentally alters human biology, not temporarily, but permanently, in measurable ways. Scott Kelly was 51 years old when he launched for that 340-day mission. He was an experienced astronaut. He knew the risks. He went anyway. That choice, made by him, enabled by NASA, built on decades of institutional decisions to prioritize exploration over full biological disclosure, is the decision at the center of this story. Sunita Williams flew to space twice. Her second mission ran far longer than planned. She and Butch Wilmore launched in June 2024 aboard Boeing's Starliner for what was supposed to be an 8-day stay. They were still on the ISS months later, waiting for a safe return. Every additional day meant additional radiation exposure. Every additional week added to a cumulative dose that their bodies would carry for the rest of their lives. Neither of them signed up for that extended exposure. Neither of them had a choice. Michael Collins orbited the moon alone during Apollo 11, while Armstrong and Aldrin walked the surface. He received significant solar particle radiation. He never made much of it publicly. He died of cancer in 2021 at age 90. His death was not officially linked to his space service. But he is one of dozens of Apollo-era astronauts whose health histories raise questions that NASA has consistently deflected. These are not abstractions. These are people. With families. With bodies that went to space and came back different. Now let's talk about what radiation actually is, in the context of the human body. Not in textbook language, but in damage language. There are 2 primary radiation threats in space. The first is solar particle events, sudden bursts from the sun that can flood a spacecraft with high-energy protons. The second is galactic, cosmic rays, high-energy particles from outside our solar system, traveling near the speed of light, that penetrate virtually everything. They go through spacecraft walls, they go through spacesuits, they go through the human body. On Earth, our planet's magnetic field deflects most of this. Our atmosphere absorbs the rest. In low Earth orbit, where the ISS sits, astronauts receive roughly 10 times the radiation of someone on the ground. On a trip to the moon, it increases further. On a Mars mission, which would take 6 to 9 months each way. Astronauts would receive cumulative doses that would breach NASA's own lifetime safety limits before they even arrived. Here is what that radiation does when it hits a human cell. It breaks the DNA strand. Sometimes the cell repairs itself correctly. Sometimes it repairs incorrectly, creating a mutation. Sometimes it doesn't repair at all. Each of those outcomes has consequences. Incorrect repair can create cancer cells. Failure to repair kills the cell. And when enough cells die in the wrong place, organ systems begin to fail. Not immediately, but over years. This isn't a theory. This is documented in survivors of radiation exposure across multiple contexts. The biological mechanism is well understood. What wasn't fully understood until recently is what galactic cosmic rays do specifically to the brain. Subscribe now if you want to know more stories like this one, because what comes next is something that almost no mainstream space coverage has fully explained. In 2017, researchers at the University of California, Irvine, published a study that should have been front-page news. They exposed mice to galactic cosmic ray simulation. What they found was not cancer, not bone density loss, not muscle atrophy, it was brain damage. Specifically, the radiation caused neuroinflammation. It destroyed synaptic connections. It impaired the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, problem-solving, and emotional regulation. The mice showed significant cognitive decline. They developed anxiety-like behavior. Their ability to complete memory tasks was measurably reduced. These were not old mice. These were healthy adults at the start of the study. The radiation changed them. The lead researcher, Charles Limoli, stated publicly that these findings meant astronauts on long-duration deep space missions would likely experience cognitive impairment and behavioral changes mid-mission. Not after landing, during the mission. The astronaut making critical decisions on the surface of Mars might already be operating with a neurologically compromised brain before they arrive. Read that again. The person making life-or-death decisions on Mars might already have radiation-damaged decision-making capabilities before the mission even reaches its destination. This finding was published, it was covered briefly. Then the news cycle moved on. NASA acknowledged the research and said it was an area of ongoing study. No mission was delayed. No fundamental change in Mars mission planning was made publicly as a result. Most people think radiation in space is a long-term cancer concern. But the real danger is the brain damage that happens during the mission itself. And NASA's own contractors confirmed it in peer-reviewed research 7 years ago. If that disturbs you, and it should, hit subscribe. Because we're just getting to the middle of this. Let's talk about eyes. In 2012, NASA released data showing that a significant percentage of astronauts who spent extended time aboard the ISS experienced vision problems, not temporary blurring. Permanent structural changes to the eye. The optic nerve swelled. The back of the eyeball flattened. The retina developed folds. Some astronauts who had perfect vision before their missions needed glasses permanently afterward. The condition was initially called Visual Impairment and Intracranial Pressure Syndrome, VIIP. NASA later renamed it Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS. The name change was subtle. The condition wasn't. Approximately 70% of astronauts who spent extended time in space reported some form of visual disruption. That number is not a small side effect. That is the majority. More than 2 out of every 3 long-duration space travelers came back with their vision changed. The leading theory is that the lack of gravity causes fluid to shift toward the head, increasing pressure in the skull, which then presses on the optic nerve and reshapes the eye. Radiation may be a contributing factor. The exact mechanism is still being studied. What isn't being studied enough is what this means for a Mars mission. A Mars mission would be far longer than anything attempted on the ISS. If 70% of ISS crew members develop vision problems on missions averaging 6 months, what percentage of a Mars crew develops them on a 30-month mission? Nobody has publicly answered that question with a number, and that silence is its own kind of answer. Now we go to the heart. Michael DeBakey was one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in American history. He was also one of the earliest voices to suggest that Apollo-era astronauts faced elevated cardiac risk from their radiation exposure. His concerns were noted. They were not prioritized. In 2016, a landmark study published in Scientific Reports examined the health records of Apollo lunar astronauts, the only humans to have traveled beyond Earth's protective magnetic field. The findings were stark. Apollo astronauts who flew to the moon died from cardiovascular disease at a rate 5 times higher than astronauts who flew only in low Earth orbit, and 5 times higher than astronauts who never left the atmosphere. 5 times. The researchers concluded that the deep space radiation encountered beyond Earth's magnetosphere likely caused damage to the cardiovascular system, specifically to the cells lining blood vessels, leading to arteriosclerosis, the hardening of arteries that causes heart attacks and strokes. 24 humans traveled to the moon. Of those, a statistically significant number died of heart disease at rates that cannot be attributed to chance or lifestyle alone. The radiation followed them home. It worked slowly. It killed them years later, in hospitals, far from any mission debrief, in ways that were logged as natural causes, because by then, there was no one officially looking for the connection. This is the investigation layer that mainstream space coverage consistently skips. The Apollo astronauts weren't just brave explorers. They were also the unknowing subjects of the largest deep space radiation experiment in human history, and the results of that experiment were published 40 years after the missions ended, in a study that received one news cycle and was never formally addressed in official NASA communications about future missions. Comment below. Did you know that Apollo astronauts had cardiovascular death rates 5 times higher than other astronauts? Because almost no one does. Let's talk about something even more disturbing. DNA and the next generation. Radiation doesn't just damage the cells of the person it hits. Under certain conditions, it can cause heritable mutations, changes to germ cells, the cells that become sperm and eggs that can be passed to children. The research on this in humans is difficult, because it requires tracking families across generations and isolating radiation as the causal variable. But in animal studies, the evidence exists. Mice exposed to galactic cosmic ray simulation showed mutations in their offspring that were not present in the control group. For astronauts who intend to have children after spaceflight, this is not a theoretical concern. Several astronauts have had children post-mission. Some have reported health concerns in their children. Most of those reports are anecdotal. Most have not been formally studied. NASA requires astronauts to be informed about radiation risks to fertility. Male astronauts are offered sperm banking before missions. Female astronauts face more complex biological considerations. The option to bank eggs is available but not standardized in the same way. What NASA does not formally do is conduct long-term, multi-generational health studies on the families of astronauts. There is no program tracking the children of people who flew to the moon. There is no registry monitoring whether post-mission astronaut children develop health conditions at different rates than the general population. That research doesn't exist, because starting it would require acknowledging that the concern is serious enough to warrant it. And acknowledging that means confronting questions about what was known, when it was known, and why missions continued anyway. Most people believe NASA is rigorous about astronaut health. And in many ways it is, but the complete picture of what happens to astronaut families across generations has never been formally examined, funded, or published. That's not oversight. That's a choice. Subscribe right now if this is the kind of deep investigation you want more of. We don't stop at the surface, we go all the way in. Now let's talk about what happens after landing. Because the damage doesn't stop when the mission ends. Astronauts returning from long-duration missions face a rehabilitation process that can last months. Muscle wastage, bone density loss, balance disruption. These are well documented and addressed in NASA's post-flight protocols. The radiation damage is different. You cannot rehabilitate a broken DNA strand. You cannot exercise away neuroinflammation. You cannot do physical therapy for a cardiovascular system that was systematically damaged by high-energy particles over 12 months. What astronauts carry home from space is invisible. It doesn't show up on a blood panel the day after landing. It manifests over years. A cancer diagnosis 7 years post-mission. A cognitive decline that begins subtly and accelerates. A heart attack at 68 from arteries that hardened slightly faster than they should have. Scott Kelly has written about persistent fatigue and cognitive changes years after his 340-day mission. He describes them carefully, without blame, as part of the cost of what he chose to do. He is not suing anyone. He is not accusing NASA. He is simply honest about the fact that he came back different, that some things didn't return to normal, that the man who landed was not identical to the man who launched. Peggy Whitson holds the American record for most total time in space, over 665 days across 3 missions. She is sharp, accomplished, and has said she would go back tomorrow. She has also never had her long-term health outcomes publicly tracked in any formal study with published results that the general public can access. Her post-mission health is considered private, and that privacy, while entirely her right, also means that the most comprehensive data point available for understanding long-duration radiation effects on a single human body is not part of the public scientific record. The astronauts who have spent the most time in space are also the people whose long-term health outcomes we know the least about. That is not an accident. That is the result of institutional decisions about privacy, liability, and narrative control. Here is the number that reframes everything. NASA's current permissible exposure limit for astronauts is defined in terms of a 3% increase in the risk of exposure-induced death, primarily from cancer. That is the acceptable risk threshold. 3%. For a Mars mission, current estimates suggest astronauts would receive radiation doses that exceed this limit before they even complete the round trip. Before they land on Mars. Before they do any science. Before they plant any flag. This means that under NASA's own safety rules, a Mars mission as currently planned is not permissible. The agency has 2 options. It can develop radiation shielding that dramatically reduces exposure, and no such shielding currently exists at a weight and scale that is practical for a crewed Mars spacecraft. Or it can change the acceptable risk threshold, raise the limit, accept a higher 3% to perhaps 5% or 8%, or whatever number makes the mission viable. This conversation is happening inside space agencies right now. It is not happening in public. The decision about what level of radiation-induced cancer risk is acceptable for a human being to take on a government-funded mission is being made by committees and not by the people who will actually be irradiated. Most people assume that if NASA sends humans to Mars, they've solved the radiation problem. They have not. They are still debating whether to accept the problem instead. That is the contrarian reality at the center of the Mars conversation, not whether we can build the rocket. Not whether we can sustain the life support, whether we are willing to send humans on a mission that we know will increase their cancer risk beyond our own safety limits and call it acceptable. Leave a comment right now. Should NASA send humans to Mars knowing the radiation exposure exceeds their own safety limits? I want to read your perspective on this because it genuinely matters to this conversation. Let's talk about what is being done. Because it would be dishonest to only present the problem without acknowledging the effort. NASA's Human Research Program exists specifically to study the risks of long-duration spaceflight, including radiation. They fund research. They collect data. They develop countermeasures. Progress is real. Hydrogen-rich shielding materials absorb some radiation more effectively than aluminum. Researchers are exploring polyethylene composites, water walls, and other approaches. Some of these are being tested. Some show promise. None are yet ready for a Mars mission. Pharmaceutical countermeasures are also being investigated. Antioxidants and certain drug compounds have shown some ability to reduce radiation-induced cellular damage in animal studies. Human trials are limited. Results are preliminary. There is also research into radiation-resistant biology, understanding why some organisms can withstand enormous radiation doses without damage, and whether any of those mechanisms can be adapted or induced in human cells. This research is fascinating. It is also decades from practical application. The honest summary is this. The problem is understood, the research is active, and the solutions are incomplete. We are sending humans into an environment that damages them in ways we cannot yet prevent, at a pace that exceeds our ability to fully mitigate the harm. That gap between what we know and what we can fix is where people live, and sometimes where people die. Subscribe to this channel right now because we cover that gap every single time. The space between what official sources say and what the evidence actually shows. That's where the real story always lives. Here is the original conclusion. Not the one NASA would write, and not the one any space booster publication would print. The era of human spaceflight has been the greatest adventure in human history. It has also been an era in which governments systematically sent human beings into an environment they knew would cause permanent biological damage, managed the information about that damage carefully, and constructed a public narrative around heroism that made it difficult to ask hard questions without seeming unpatriotic or anti-science. The astronauts themselves, virtually without exception, understood the risks and chose to go. That choice deserves profound respect. Their courage is not in question. What is in question is the institutional framework around that courage. The decisions made not by the astronauts but by the agencies and contractors and committees that set exposure limits, that delayed health studies, that kept families in the dark about multi-generational risks, that are right now deciding how much cancer risk is acceptable to send someone to Mars without asking that person's future children whether they consent to whatever heritable mutations might come with the mission. The real story of space radiation is not just about what happens to astronauts' bodies. It's about who decides what risks are acceptable, who bears the consequences, and who gets to tell the story afterward. The moon landing was real. The sacrifice behind it was also real. And the full accounting of what that sacrifice cost, biologically, medically, across generations, has never been fully published, never been fully funded, and never been fully told. Until now. Scott Kelly's twin brother Mark went to space briefly, years earlier. For the NASA twin study, Mark was the control group. He stayed on Earth while Scott spent nearly a year in orbit. When Scott came back, his telomeres, his genes, his cognitive function, his vision, all of it had shifted. Mark was largely unchanged. Same DNA, same genetics, same family, entirely different biological outcomes. The difference was 340 days in space. Scott Kelly does not regret going. He has said so publicly, repeatedly, with obvious sincerity. He would go again. He believes in the mission. He believes exploration is worth the cost. But he also knows something now that he didn't know when he launched. He knows exactly what that cost looks like inside a human body. He knows what it means to land and find out you're not quite who you were. He knows that the damage is real, that it's permanent in some ways, and that the smiling astronaut standing next to the capsule on landing day is already carrying injuries that won't fully reveal themselves for years. The next person who spends a year in space will know this too, and the person after that. And every member of whatever Mars crew eventually leaves Earth for the Red Planet. They will go anyway, because they are the kind of people who go anyway. And because humanity has always been willing to send its most courageous members into the unknown, even when the unknown turns out to be biological damage, we can measure but cannot stop. The question is not whether we should explore. Of course we should. The question is whether we are honest enough, as agencies, as nations, as a civilization, to fully account for what exploration costs the people who actually do it. The stars don't care about our safety limits. Space doesn't negotiate. Radiation doesn't read the mission briefing. Only we can decide what a human life is worth in the pursuit of what lies beyond. And so far, we haven't been fully honest about what we've decided. If this video changed how you think about space exploration, if you didn't know about the brain damage research, the Apollo cardiac deaths, the vision loss in 70% of long-duration astronauts, or NASA's radiation limits for Mars, share this right now with someone who thinks space agencies have all of this figured out. Because the conversation we just had is the one that needs to happen publicly, loudly, and often. Subscribe to this channel. We cover the stories that exist between the headlines and the press releases. The ones that take an hour of research to find and that nobody in mainstream science communication is telling clearly. Every week. No fluff. No inspirational oversimplification. Just the full story. And comment below with this. What surprised you most? The brain damage findings? The cardiac deaths in Apollo astronauts? The fact that a Mars mission already exceeds NASA's own safety limits? Tell me which part hit hardest. I read every comment on videos like this. The next video we are releasing covers what happens to the human body in a vacuum. Not in theory, but in the 3 documented cases where humans were actually exposed to near-vacuum conditions and survived. It is disturbing, it is medically fascinating, and it is nothing like what movies show you. You'll want to be subscribed before that one drops.